At my wedding, my father sneered and said, "Take off those silly medals in front of 280 guests." When I refused, he slapped me across the face. That's when my Navy SEAL fiancé grabbed his wrist and said 8 words that made the entire chapel rise to their feet in solidarity. The sound cracked across the room like a pistol shot. 280 guests froze mid-sip of champagne, forks suspended above plates of prime rib, eyes darting between us in disbelief. The sting bloomed across my cheek, but I didn't flinch. My medals shifted slightly with the impact, the rows of ribbons clinking faintly against each other like they were reminding me why I stood tall in the first place. Richard Holstead, chairman of Holstead Enterprises, a man who'd built a tech empire worth $340 million from the ground up, had just struck his daughter at her own wedding. Not in private anger, but in public humiliation. The hall smelled of polished wood, roses, and expensive whiskey, but all I could feel was the burn on my face and the weight of 280 pairs of eyes. He'd already issued his command once, voice dripping with disdain. "Take off those silly medals." He said it like the service ribbons on my chest were cheap costume jewelry, an embarrassment to his carefully curated image. I'd refused with a quiet shake of my head, chin-high posture drilled into my bones from years of standing inspection. And that's when his hand lashed out. Before I could react, another hand intercepted him, strong, steady, gloved in white. My fiancé James, a Navy SEAL commander, had stepped between us. He gripped my father's wrist with iron control, calm but unyielding, and leaned close enough for only the front rows to hear. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." 8 words, delivered low and deliberate. Whatever power Dad thought he held evaporated instantly. The whole room rose to their feet. It wasn't chaos, it was collective judgment, a wave of movement, a silent verdict. The CEO, who had built his empire on commanding attention, suddenly looked small, his face drained of color, eyes darting like a cornered animal. My cheeks still burned, but my pride didn't waver. I stood straighter because in that moment, I wasn't just a daughter, I was Commander Rachel Holstead. Decorated officer with 12 years of service, combat veteran with 4 Purple Hearts, and recipient of the Navy Cross for valor under fire. I had carried my weight in deserts and on decks halfway around the world. What my father never understood was that those silly medals represented something he could never buy. Honor earned through sacrifice. You're probably wondering how we got here. Why a father would slap his daughter on her wedding day. Why a uniform could ignite such fury in a man worth hundreds of millions. To understand that moment, you have to know where I came from, and more importantly, who I'd become while he wasn't paying attention. I grew up in a house where power was currency, and love was rationed out like quarterly dividends. Our estate sat on 40 acres outside Boston, a glass and stone monument to success filled with leather chairs, oil paintings, and silence. Dad was the kind of man who measured worth by profit margins and dinner conversations by who he could impress at the country club. From the time I could walk, my path was mapped in his head. Prep school, Harvard business, a seat on the board, and eventually the corner office of Holstead Enterprises. He didn't raise children, he cultivated heirs. My 3 brothers fell in line perfectly. Carbon copies in tailored suits, already talking hedge funds and IPOs by age 16. But I was different. While they studied balance sheets, I devoured military history. While they practiced golf swings, I stared out windows at the flag whipping in the evening wind, wondering what it would feel like to earn the right to salute it. The breaking point came when I was 12. I'd gotten an A in civics and proudly announced I wanted to join the junior ROTC program at school. Dad didn't even look up from his steak. "Ridiculous," he said. "Marching around in cheap uniforms won't put food on the table." "But Dad, it's about service, about leadership." He slammed his knife down, silver clattering against porcelain. The room went still. Don't waste your breath. You're not joining any program that teaches you to salute others. Holsteads are saluted. We don't serve. We're served. That night, lying awake, I decided I would remember every word, not as chains to bind me, but as fuel to prove him wrong. When I announced my intention to apply to the Naval Academy, Dad reacted like I'd announced I was joining the circus. "You're throwing away every advantage I've built for you," he barked. "Do you know what people will say when they hear my daughter is crawling through mud instead of running board meetings?" "I don't care what they say," I replied, voice trembling but steady. "This is my choice." He stared at me for a long moment, then delivered the sentence that would ring in my ears for years. "If you walk down that path, don't expect me to walk beside you." And he meant it. The day my acceptance letter arrived from Annapolis, I ran into the living room, heart pounding, letter trembling in my hands. Mom cried with joy. Dad just stared at the envelope for 30 seconds before muttering, "So you're serious about this nonsense," and walking out of the room. He didn't speak to me for 2 months, but what Dad never realized was that his dismissal only strengthened my resolve. While he saw the Naval Academy as throwing my life away, I saw it as the first step toward building something he could never understand. A career based on merit, not inheritance. Annapolis was everything he said it would be: grueling, unrelenting, merciless. But what he didn't know was that I thrived under pressure. The first weeks nearly broke me. Up before dawn, running until my lungs burned, push-ups until my arms trembled, inspections where a single wrinkle could mean hours of extra drills. I remember standing at attention, sweat dripping down my spine, hearing an instructor bark in my face. "You think Daddy's money can get you through this? Think again." I wanted to yell that I'd walked away from all that money, but I didn't. I just gritted my teeth and endured. Every insult, every punishing drill was fuel. There were nights I collapsed into bed, muscles screaming, wondering if Dad was right. Then I'd picture him smirking over his scotch, telling colleagues his daughter had failed, and that thought lit a fire in me. Failure wasn't an option. By sophomore year, I found my rhythm. I studied harder than I ever had, memorizing strategy, logistics, history while others went out drinking. I ran until my legs felt like steel. Slowly, I rose through the ranks, not because I was the strongest, but because I refused to quit. My first promotion ceremony was a moment I'll never forget. My commanding officer pinned on my new insignia, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of responsibility pressing into my shoulders. I called home afterward, voice full of pride. The line rang and rang, no answer, so I mailed a photo of the ceremony. Weeks later, I got a single envelope back. Inside wasn't congratulations. It was a clipped article about my brother's internship at Goldman Sachs. A yellow sticky note in Dad's handwriting read, "This is what success looks like." I tore it in half. The divide only widened over the years. My father's world revolved around profits and prestige. Mine revolved around service and sacrifice. Each holiday homecoming turned into another battlefield. "So, still playing soldier?" he'd ask, swirling bourbon at the head of the table. "It's not playing," I'd reply. "Medals don't pay mortgages," he'd snap back. Mom would intervene with quiet dignity. "Not everything has to be about money, Richard." He'd scoff, retreat into silence, and I'd leave the table with my appetite gone. What Dad never understood was that I'd found a new kind of family, one forged in fire, not blood. My classmates became brothers and sisters. We endured together, sweated together, picked each other up when we fell. There was no boardroom hierarchy, no stock options. There was only the mission and whether you could be trusted to carry it out. Graduation was bittersweet. I stood in dress whites, cap tucked under my arm as the band played and crowds cheered. Rows of proud families waved flags and snapped photos. I scanned the stands, searching for one face I knew I wouldn't find. Dad hadn't come. Not for the ceremony, not for commissioning, not for the moment his daughter officially became an officer in the United States Navy. Mom was there, though, dabbing tears from her eyes. She hugged me so tight afterward I could barely breathe. "He's wrong about you," she whispered. "You've already proven more than he ever has." Her words stayed with me through the years that followed. Deployment came quickly. My first assignment was logistics coordination in the Pacific Fleet, far from the glittering skyscrapers Dad loved to point to as symbols of power. The work wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. I learned to project authority, not with volume, but with competence. Years passed. I collected ribbons instead of wealth. Each one represented survival, endurance. Moments Dad would never comprehend. When I dragged a wounded Marine across 50 yards of hostile fire in Afghanistan. When I coordinated the evacuation of a field hospital under mortar attack. When I refused medical attention for shrapnel wounds until every man under my command was accounted for. These weren't just acts of duty, they were acts of defiance against the man who said I couldn't. With every medal pinned to my chest, I felt the distance between us grow wider. He had his empire of glass and steel. I had my empire of grit and loyalty. He never visited, never called, never once said he was proud. But I stopped needing him to because by then I'd built something stronger than his approval. I'd built myself. Combat taught me that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And the day I earned mine was during a joint operation that went sideways fast. Intelligence had shifted, a friendly convoy strayed too far off a safe route, and the desert decided to swallow our plans whole. I wasn't supposed to be point, I was the logistics officer, the one with clipboards and manifests. But when a truck's axle snapped and its driver went quiet on comms, I was the closest with authority to move. I didn't ask permission. I moved. What followed was the longest 30 minutes of my life. Under hostile fire, a medic and I extracted the driver from his overturned vehicle. He was pinned under the dashboard, conscious but bleeding badly, trying to apologize for inconveniencing us. People apologize a lot when they're dying. We cut him free with borrowed tools and dragged him to the extraction point as rounds pinged off the metal around us. When the helicopter finally roared in and we loaded him aboard, I realized my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I tucked them behind my back so no one would see, then walked out in front of my team with steady steps. Because steadiness is a language leaders have to speak, even when their hearts are hammering. That operation changed everything. Word traveled the way it does in tight communities, quietly sideways. A SEAL detachment that had watched us work started showing up at our training range during off hours. At first I thought they were humoring me, the polite nods you give to an officer who isn't quite one of you. But they kept coming back, not to test me, but to train with me. They were older, scarred in ways the body records, reserved in ways pain demands. Yet around the rack of battered kettlebells and rusted pull-up bars, we found a rhythm. There was Torres, who ran on a prosthetic like the ground owed him time. Riley, whose voice never rose above a calm murmur regardless of circumstances. And Hill, who smiled with one corner of his mouth and called me ma'am, like the word meant the difference between chaos and order. I didn't earn their respect with speeches, I earned it with attendance. Showing up again, showing up when it rained and hurt and would have been easier to send an email instead. We started blending operations, practice first, then real missions. I brought structure to places that preferred mystery. They brought cunning to plans that looked good on whiteboards. The partnership worked because we understood something Dad never could. True authority comes from competence, not position. That's how I met James. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to fill silence. He let it sit until it turned comfortable. No flash, no chest thumping, just steady calm that cut through rooms like clean air. Navy SEAL commander, though you'd never know unless someone told you. We met during a joint briefing at the Pentagon. I was presenting logistics reform, dry material that could put anyone to sleep. He listened without blinking, arms folded, eyes sharp. When the session ended, he stopped me in the hallway. "You don't just move supplies," he said. "You move lives." It was the kind of comment that sticks not because it flatters, but because it sees. Over months of crossing paths at briefings and exercises, he noticed small details. How I took my coffee, how I stayed late not because I had to, but because something unfinished gnawed at me. He never once asked me to be less than I was. Our first official date was nothing movie-worthy, dinner off base, 2 plates of eggs and bacon, a waitress who called everyone. "Honey?" But I remember thinking, this is what normal feels like. No spotlight, no agenda, just 2 people who'd seen enough darkness to appreciate ordinary light. His proposal was as unadorned as the man himself. No choreographed show, just the 2 of us on a weathered pier in Norfolk, boots dangling over water, gulls crying overhead. He held out a small box and said, "I can't promise calm seas, but I can promise to row with you." Some proposals are fireworks. His was ballast. I said yes because I knew he understood the difference between decoration and evidence. When we announced our engagement, my father's response arrived not by call or letter, but by silence. Weeks later, at a family gathering, he cornered me near the bar, bourbon glinting in low light. "You'll wear a proper dress," he said flatly. "Not that uniform, not in front of my associates. You won't embarrass me." "I'm not marrying you," I replied. "I'm marrying him, and I'll wear what tells the truth." His jaw tightened. "Do you understand how humiliating this is? People will whisper." "Then let them whisper. At least I'll know I'm not lying." He turned away, muttering into his glass, but I knew the battle lines were drawn. Planning the wedding was deliberately simple. We chose the Naval Chapel, clean lines, stained glass that caught morning sun, pews worn smooth by years of hands and prayers. The guest list was modest, close friends, comrades, a few family members I still spoke to. The SEALs heard about it, of course. I never invited them formally, but one by one they told me they'd be there. Torres grinned, prosthetic leg tapping the floor. "You walked us through hell. We're not letting you walk that aisle alone." I tried to argue. They shook their heads. Non-negotiable. A week before the ceremony, I wrote my father a card, not out of hope that had drained from me long ago, but out of completeness. "I'm getting married this Saturday. 1 p.m. Naval Chapel. I'll be in uniform." I sealed it before I could add anything I'd regret. The night before, tradition kept James and me apart. At midnight, I ironed my dress whites with the same attention I'd give a mission briefing. Each ribbon aligned, each button polished, shoes reflecting ceiling lights like mirrors. My phone buzzed, a message from a number I knew by heart but had never saved. "You'll regret this tomorrow." I stared at the screen, not in shock, but in clarity. This was exactly who he was and exactly who I was not. I placed the phone face down, pressed one last crease into the white fabric, and whispered to the empty room. "Tomorrow I walk as myself." The morning dawned sharp and clear. Outside the chapel, my team gathered in formation, medals gleaming, backs straight. Some I hadn't seen in years. All came without being asked. "Ready?" Hill asked quietly. I nodded. What I didn't know was how quickly the day would shift, how a father's need for control would boil over into a moment that would silence 280 guests and leave him pale as stone. The chapel held 2 distinct worlds that morning. On one side sat CEOs, investors, men and women in tailored suits with smiles sharpened by boardrooms and balance sheets. Dad's crowd, gathered more to judge optics than celebrate love. On the other side were uniforms, SEALs, Marines, sailors, people I'd trained with, bled with, buried friends alongside. They weren't there for appearances. They were there for me. The tension was visible in the gap between those groups, a gulf wider than any aisle. I stood at the back with Hill and Torres flanking me, both in dress uniform. Torres leaned lightly on his prosthetic, expression calm but unyielding. Hill adjusted his cuffs, then glanced at me with a small smirk. You look like a commander about to take the field." "Feel about the same," I replied. "Difference is," Torres added, "this time we're walking with you." Guests whispered as they caught sight of me. The uniform was impossible to ignore. Rows of ribbons lined my chest, each one a chapter of sacrifice. The insignia on my shoulders seemed to shine brighter under stained glass light than diamonds on half the women's wrists. From the front row, my father's stare cut through the air. His tuxedo was midnight black, tie knotted with the precision of a man who couldn't afford mistakes. He looked like power incarnate, until you noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped his program just too tightly. When our eyes met, he raised one eyebrow as if to say, "Don't test me." The music began, organ notes climbing like tide rolling in. My chest tightened, not from nerves, but from clarity. Each step down that aisle felt less like a bride's walk and more like a march toward truth. Halfway down, I caught sight of James at the altar. Navy dress blues, simple and grounded like him. His eyes lit when he saw me, not with surprise since he'd known I'd wear the uniform, but with something deeper, pride, belonging. For the first time in years, I felt all pieces of my life align. But before I could reach him, the storm broke. Dad rose from his seat, movement slow and deliberate, designed to draw every eye. He stepped into the aisle, forcing me to stop short. A murmur rippled through the room. The organ faltered, notes cutting off like held breath. He looked me up and down, lips curling into a sneer that carried more disdain than words ever could. Then he said it, voice pitched for the entire chapel. "Take off those silly medals." The words dropped into silence like stones into still water. The crowd tensed. Someone in the back gasped. My throat tightened, not with shame, but with the weight of every year that had led to this moment. I straightened my spine, meeting his gaze without flinching. "No." For a beat, the world held its breath. Then his hand shot out. The slap came faster than I expected, a crack that echoed off stained glass. My cheek burned, head snapped to the side, but my bearing never altered. Gasps erupted. Glass shattered somewhere near the back. For one split second, the room froze in disbelief. Then James moved. He stepped forward, hand locking around my father's wrist with a grip that brooked no argument. Calm, steady, deliberate, the way only a man who'd stared down worse storms could be. He leaned in close, voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." Those 8 words carried the weight of command and the authority of every person in that room who knew what service meant. The chapel erupted, not in chaos, but in solidarity. 280 people rose as one. Suits, gowns, uniforms, all on their feet. No one instructed them. No one asked. They stood because they knew where honor belonged. My father tried to speak, mouth opening like a man about to launch into a boardroom tirade, but no words came. He'd spent his life controlling narratives, silencing dissent with money and intimidation. But this wasn't a conference table. This was a chapel filled with people who measured worth not in dollars, but in sacrifice. James released his wrist with deliberate care, as though letting go of something already broken. Dad stumbled back half a step, rubbing where he'd been held, humility etched deeper than any bruise could show. Torres, leaning on his prosthetic, broke the silence with 3 words that rang louder than the organ ever could. "Commander on deck." Every military person snapped to attention, saluting with crisp precision. Even some civilians followed suit, awkward but sincere. The air grew thick with reverence, the kind you don't fake, the kind that can't be bought. My father's empire had never inspired this, not once. I looked at him then, really looked. The man who dismissed my dreams, cut me from conversations, silenced me with disdain. He'd thought today would be his triumph, a chance to parade wealth and influence. Instead, he stood pale and trembling, diminished under gazes of people he could never control. He'd always told me medals were silly. In that moment, they were the only truth that mattered. I walked the rest of the aisle, each step echoing like drumbeats of defiance. James waited with steady eyes, pride written across his face. As I reached him, Hill and Torres stepped back with crisp dignity. The chaplain cleared his throat, voice unsteady at first, then strong. "Shall we continue?" "Copy that," I said. The ceremony resumed, but nothing felt small anymore. Every vow carried weight of what had just transpired. When James took my hands and promised to serve not just my heart, but my peace, I felt the sting on my cheek fade into something far greater: vindication. At the reception afterward, whispers ran through the crowd like wind through grass. People replayed the moment, the slap, the silence, the 8 words, the standing ovation. But no one dared laugh. No one dared diminish what had happened. My father left quietly before cake was cut. No big exit, no parting speech, just a man slipping into night, stripped of authority he'd thought unshakable. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to, because truth had been spoken, witnessed, and sealed. Later that night, James and I stepped outside for air. Moonlight pulled across water, soft and silver. He touched my cheek gently, thumb brushing the faint red mark. "Does it hurt?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not anymore." He smiled. "Good, because what people will remember isn't the slap. It's how you stood." And he was right. That's the thing about the most powerful kind of victory. It's not loud or violent. It's standing so tall that people who tried to break you can no longer look down. My father will always be a wealthy CEO. That's his legacy. But mine is different. Mine is honor earned in deserts and seas, carried in scars and ribbons, saluted by people who never once asked me to be less than I was. When the world rose that day, not for wealth or power, but for respect, it wasn't just my wedding. It was my reckoning. And in that chapel filled with witnesses, the daughter who was supposed to be an embarrassment became the woman who commanded a room without saying a word. Those silly medals had done exactly what they were meant to do. They told the truth about who I really was.